Random House Audio presents The Columbus Affair by Steve Barry. Read for you by Scott Brick. For 500 years, historians have pondered the question, who was Christopher Columbus? The answer is simply another question. Who do you want him to be? Anonymous Observer. Jamaica, 1504 CE. Prologue. Christopher Columbus realized that the decisive moment was approaching. His party had trudged south through the lush forest of this tropical land for the past 3 days, steadily gaining altitude. Of all the islands he'd discovered since that first landfall in October 1492, this was the fairest his eyes had seen. A narrow plain rimmed its rocky coast. Mountains formed a misted spine, rising gradually from the west and culminating here in the east at the tortuous chain of peaks now surrounding him. Most of the earth was porous limestone covered by fertile red soil. An incredible array of plants flourished beneath thick stands of old-growth forest, all nourished by constant moist winds. The natives who lived here called the place Shemaka, which he'd learned meant Isle of Springs. Apt, for water abounded everywhere. Since Castilian substituted a J for X, he'd come to call it Jamaica. "Admiral." He stopped and turned to face one of his men. "It is not far," de Torres said to him, pointing ahead. "Down the ridge to the flat point, then beyond a clearing." Luis had sailed with him on all 3 previous voyages, including the one in 1492 when they'd first stepped ashore. They understood and trusted each other. He could not say the same for the 6 natives who carted the crates. They were heathens. He pointed at 2 who toted one of the smaller containers and motioned with his hands for them to be careful. He was surprised that after 2 years the wood was still intact. No worms had bored through, as they had last year with his ship's hull. 1 year he'd spent marooned on this island. But his captivity was now over. "You chose well," he said to de Torres in Spanish. None of the natives could speak the language. 3 more Spaniards accompanied him and Torres, each specially chosen. The locals had been conscripted, bribed with the promise of more hawk's bells, trinkets, the sound of which seemed to fascinate them, if they would but haul 3 crates into the mountains. They'd begun at dawn in a wooded glade adjacent to the north shore, a nearby river pouring sparkling cold water down smooth ledges, forming pool after pool, finally making one last silvery plunge to the sea. A constant chirping of insects and the call of birds had increased in volume, now reaching a boisterous crescendo. The trudge up the wooded slope had taken effort, and all of them were winded, their clothes soaked in sweat, grime layering their faces. Now they were headed back down into a lush valley. For the first time in a long while, he felt rejuvenated. He loved this land. The first voyage in 1492 had been carried out under his personal leadership, against the advice of so-called learned people. 87 men had ventured into the unknown on the strength of his dream. He'd struggled for decades to obtain the funding, first from the Portuguese, then from the Spanish. The capitulations of Santa Fe, signed between him and the Spanish crown, had promised him noble status, 10% of all riches, and control of the seas he discovered. An excellent bargain on paper, but Ferdinand and Isabella had not kept their end. For the past 12 years, after he'd established the existence of what all were calling a new world, one Spanish ship after another had sailed westward, each without permission from him as Admiral of the Ocean Sea. Whores. Liars. All of them. "There!" de Torres called out. He stopped his descent and glanced through the trees past thousands of red blossoms the natives called flame of the forest. He spotted a clear pool, flat as glass, the roar of more active water leading in and out. He had first visited Jamaica in May 1494 on his second voyage, and discovered that its northern coast was inhabited by the same natives found on the nearby islands, except those here were more hostile. Perhaps their proximity to the Caribs, who lived on Puerto Rico to the east, accounted for that aggressiveness. Caribs were fierce cannibals who understood only force. Learning from the past, he'd dispatched bloodhounds and bowsmen to initially deal with the Jamaicans, killing a few, savaging others, until they all became anxious to please. He halted the caravan's advance at the pool. De Torres approached and whispered, "It is here, the place." He knew that this would be his last time in his new world. He was 51 years old and had managed to accumulate an impressive array of enemies. His experience of the past year was evidence. This fourth voyage cursed from the start. He'd first explored the coast of what he'd come to believe was a continent, its shoreline endless, extending north to south for as far as he'd sailed. After completing that reconnoiter, he'd hoped to make landfall in Cuba or Hispaniola, but his worm-eaten vessels only made it as far as Jamaica, where he beached them both and awaited a rescue. None had come. The governor of Hispaniola, a sworn enemy, decided to let him and his 113 men die. But that had not occurred. Instead, a few brave souls had rowed a canoe to Hispaniola and brought a ship back. Yes, he had indeed amassed enemies. They'd succeeded in negating all of the rights he once possessed from the capitulations. He'd managed to retain his noble status and title of admiral, but they meant nothing. The colonists in Santo Domingo had even revolted and forced him to sign a humiliating settlement agreement. 4 horrible years ago he was returned to Spain in chains and threatened with trial and imprisonment. But the king and queen provided an unexpected reprieve, then granted him funds and permission for a 4th crossing. He'd wondered about their motivations. Isabella seemed sincere. She was an adventurous soul. But the king was another matter. Ferdinand had never cared for him, openly saying that any trip across the Western Ocean seemed a folly. Of course, that was before he'd succeeded. Now all Ferdinand wanted was gold and silver. Whores. Liars. All of them. He motioned for the crates to be lowered. His 3 men helped, as each was heavy. "We are here," he called out in Spanish. His men knew what to do. Swords were drawn and the natives were quickly cut to pieces. 2 groaned on the ground, but were silenced with skewers to the chest. Their killing meant nothing to him. They were unworthy to breathe the same air as Europeans. Small, copper-brown, naked as the day they were born, they possessed no written language and no fervent beliefs. They lived in seaside villages and, to his observations, accomplished nothing other than growing a few crops. They were led by a man called a cacique, whom he'd made friends with during his marooned year. It was the cacique who'd granted him 6 men yesterday when he'd dropped anchor for the final time along the north shore. "A simple trek to the mountains," he'd told the chieftain. "A few days' time." He knew enough of their Arawak language to convey his request. The cacique had acknowledged that he understood and agreed, motioning toward 6 who would carry the crates. He'd bowed in gratitude and offered several hawksbells as gifts. Thanks to heaven that he'd brought a quantity of them with him. In Europe they were tied to the talons of trained birds. Worthless. Here they were hard currency. The cacique had accepted the payment and returned a bow. He'd dealt with this leader twice before. They'd forged a friendship, an understanding, one he took full advantage of. When he'd first visited the island in 1494, stopping for a day to caulk leaks in his ship and to replenish the water supply, his men had noticed fine bits of gold in the clear streams. On questioning the cacique, he'd learned of a place where the golden grains were large.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?